Again, Shelly Rambo has become one of my favorite theologians, and in my retirement, I'm going to be doing hopefully even more work, getting more deeply into especially her second book, Resurrecting Wounds. Frances and I became aware of her first books, Spirit and Trauma, through a friend of Frances's who was experiencing the loss through cancer of a spouse, and was going through the real difficulty of dealing with grief and loss, and read the book, and we got it and then read it, and it just opened up new horizons for us, not only in ministry, but as some of you know, I've been working through the theology of the cross for many years now, and it's opened up very many new horizons for me in that work. Shelly grew up in Canada and the New York area, and she's a very urban person, being in Boston University School of Theology. So when she got off the plane yesterday, she did not take an Uber in. She immediately went to the metro and made her way in directly to where the hotel is. So that shows you what kind of a person she is. She's an urban person, so she understands the urban life like is around us and New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and all the work that we do in a variety of different ways, including the new homeless center that has opened up in our park level. So, you know, this is such a highly relevant program for us and our ministry at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Shelly is a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, Yale University, and she received her PhD at Emory, Candler School of Theology, or Emory University. And again, her first book is Spirit and Trauma, and the second, Resurrecting Wounds. Oh, boy, I commend both of them to you. They're amazing work. So without further ado, Shelly Rambo.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Roger and Theo, for the invitation. And I'm actually on sabbatical. So the idea of lecturing to you is not at all inviting. So I'm grateful for the invitation, and really my preference would be to come to your tables and ask, who are you, what do you do, and why are you here? But I can't really do that because I'm being videotaped. So I'm really hoping that what I present today connects with you in the different contexts in which you work. I've already heard from a couple of you who are working with refugees, who are working in clinical settings. Wherever you're at, what I'm hoping to do is provide a way of framing trauma, and a new term to many that I'm going to use, moral injury. How those frameworks, I think, are helpful to give, may be helpful for your context, but I think are helpful for thinking about faith and what our theologies have to say about suffering and trauma. So I'm going to be moving around a little bit because I did not bring my clicker, so I'm going to be the human clicker. And what I heard in preparation for coming, what I heard from your ministers is that many of you are working in context where trauma is not a distant reality, but a very present one. I would say that for many of us, trauma touches us both personally, collectively, institutionally. Institutional histories are particularly interesting to think about in relationship to trauma. So I'm going to make a basic assumption that you are in some way a caregiver, that you are somebody who, within your context, whether that's within your family, or within your particular work setting, as somebody who might attend this church, but you're very involved in the ministries of this church, you provide care in very particular ways. So I'm going to make that that assumption. And if that doesn't apply to you, I hope you can imaginatively find your way into thinking about yourself as a caregiver. A lot of the work that I've been doing is interacting with chaplains. And I can talk a little bit more about that maybe at the lunch session. But how I got deeply into my more practical work on trauma was through the work of military chaplains. Some of you know this, military chaplains who found themselves in my classroom between pretty incredible deployments. So the military, some of you may know this, the military provides educational opportunities for chaplains who have maybe been deployed and are coming back and may assume teaching positions. And these chaplains really transformed my scholarship. And they continue to do that, not just the military chaplains, but now working more closely with healthcare chaplains, people working within prisons. And it's not hard to imagine that chaplains, given the topic that I work on from a theological perspective, that chaplains are people who are caregivers at these very complex sites of trauma. Very true of military chaplains who found themselves providing forms of care that they had not been trained for. When literatures of PTSD kind of came flooding in, they were expected to somehow be versatile in this discourse, but they felt that that was very disconnected from the language of faith. So somehow the theological language and frameworks and these clinical frameworks, they seemed very separate. So my work really insists that they're not very separate. There's ways of talking about healing, there's ways of talking about human flourishing that both clinicians and therapists and those clinical discourses speak about that, and also ministers and people who are working with theological frameworks, biblical texts, sacred texts, are also talking a lot about healing. So why are these so separate? This was my question. And the military chaplains definitely felt like they had to transform their whole being to somehow think about working with the PTSD literature. So I'm hoping that I meet you at that kind of intersection where I bring the language of faith and the language of really our common cultural language, if you think about it, is a kind of therapeutic modality. We often defer to medical, clinical language to think about how we're doing, right? How stressed out we are, right? What our diagnoses are. And I think the language of faith both connects to that language, but also speaks back to it in powerful ways. Why do we diagnose the human condition that way, right? Why do we see suffering as pathology? Are there other ways of viewing it? So our faith lens brings a certain way of looking at these questions that might, cause us to think, well, maybe my diagnosis is a little bit different than what I thought it was, right? And I think you'll hear tomorrow that Jesus, the teacher, the complex healer in a way, has something to say about who we are and what's going on in our current situation. So my assumption is that you're a caregiver. So find your way into that. For over a decade, I've been studying trauma, and I'm going to tell you how the particular way that I entered that term, because that's a big term, and often needs some explanation in terms of how we enter that concept. But there's also an emerging concept of moral injury that I think is very provocative for thinking about the condition of our souls, right? So this is the title is Shrinking Souls. I thought I'd give you this basic thesis, our souls are shrinking, and see how you respond. So I did kind of just give that to you. But that I think the studies in moral injury are saying that there's some injury that can happen to our soul, and that it doesn't easily go away. So how do we think about injuries or violations of our moral center? It's not hard to speak that in Washington, D.C. at this time. And I think moral injury is emerging as a clinical category, largely connected to working with veterans. It kind of arises out of the VA, but now there's a kind of contagion of the term because it's touching something that I think is very powerful. It's to say, what work is being done collectively on our moral center? Are we off center in terms of our moral condition? So I use these two, trauma and moral injury, as frameworks to think about who we are and who we are as persons of faith. How do we live out our faith in a time of cumulative trauma and, let's call it, moral injury or moral threat? So in the midst of cumulative trauma, how do we keep our hearts open? I really think this is a caregiver question. How do we keep our souls from shrinking? The question initially came to me, how do we keep our hearts open? It was a question that one of my mentors, Wendy Farley, another theologian, she was given the opportunity to ask the Dalai Lama one question. Okay, that would be a cool table conversation. If you could ask the Dalai Lama one thing. But Wendy Farley was actually invited to ask that question. And Wendy came to my classroom a couple of days before she was flying out to meet the Dalai Lama. And of course, our burning question was, what's your question? What are you going to ask him? And I don't know that I'm going to get the quote exactly right, but she said, I'm going to ask the Dalai Lama, if we keep ourselves, if my students, so she's a professor, she was thinking about her students, if they open themselves to compassion, how do we know that they won't be eaten up? I think it was fancier than that, but maybe not. She said, with their big hearts, how do we know that their hearts aren't going to get crushed, get broken? And that very much for me, because I see the next generation of leaders in my classroom, that is increasingly my question. Not exploring the trauma, because the trauma's there, but exploring this other side, which is, how do we keep our hearts open? How do we keep our hearts open to the work, and how do we keep our souls from shrinking? So I'm going to toss the question to you. It's a good teaching strategy, right? Because I would rather work with what you give me. So here's what I want you to do. You may not be able to read this, so I'm going to give you the instructions. What I want you to do is bring to mind a traumatic, you can define that as however you want, it's in quotes. Bring to mind a traumatic situation or incident that you were involved in as a first responder or a caregiver, right? So bring a particular incident to mind that you were involved in as a first responder. And I want you to think for a minute, what did you do well? And what do you wish you had known or done? So I want you to think about it, and then I want you to share with your neighbor. Now, I want you to share with your neighbor without describing the situation. They don't need to know. I don't want you to get into description. Okay, this is challenging for some people. So don't describe what happened. Share what did you do well and what do you wish you had known or done. Are the instructions clear? Okay, so just bring that to mind, and when you're ready, turn to someone. It could be one person or two people, and just share about 5 minutes. Take turns. Good. Okay. Whoever's talking, wind up. Okay. Now I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then get some feedback from your tables. Did you notice any difference in your body when you were sharing? You don't have to answer that. Just, did you notice any difference in your body when you were sharing responses? What did this situation smell like? Sound like? Did any specific images come to mind that stand out to you when you were sharing? When I asked you to bring something to mind, was there any image, smell, sound, feel? Did any of you find it hard not to share the situation? Or did you end up sharing the situation? Did you violate the rules a little bit? That's a challenge, actually, often, because what we want to do is we get caught up in what happened, and I wanted you to notice some of these other things. Which is, what did it feel like, smell like? So I'm going to invite a couple, based on what you give me, determines where I go next. So anything that you want to share from your conversation about that experience, not telling me what you told, but about how you experienced that activity. Yes. Right.
We don't have regrets. We don't have, like, we didn't feel like we made some major error. We sort of ran when we would do something that wasn't productive. You know, we would let it run its course and learn from it. But but we had a sense that it was enough, and maybe sort of wished we had known how important that was at Hayward.
Yeah. So at the time, you may not have felt that you were enough. Yeah, pretty overwhelmed, right? So any other experiences of that where what happened to you, what was happening so fast, it was overwhelming?
It was also helpful. It was nice to be given permission not to talk about the event, but to talk about what we did.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't talk, get lost in one.
Yeah. I'm going to try to recap. So it was helpful not to share about the event because you get caught up in that, but to focus on what you did well. And I love that you were able to kind of have a generous read to say, I think we did pretty well. So that was the initial. I think we did pretty well with what we had in the midst of something that was rather overwhelming. So thank you. Others, and I'm going to try to recap so that we can get it. If I misquote you, please feel free to correct me. Yes, Gwen.
At our table, people felt like they could respond immediately, get into it, sort of sink into the situation. without a whole lot of emotion or overthinking. Just you do what needs to be done and you take care of it. I wasn't able to respond in our group in time, but one of the things that I found was that once you sink in into that mode, you're sort of not emotionless, but it's hard to get out of it. Like you get trapped into that, okay, we're just dealing with everything. And then when the crisis is gone, you're still like managing things like that.
Yeah, really nice. I mean, that a lot of us do what we really need to do immediately, and then a kind of perhaps lingering sense of like, it leaves us with a lot to process. Is that?
Well, you're not processing. You're just
Yeah.
you're managing whatever the next situation is, even if it's not a crisis. You're like, okay,
Oh, yeah.
so this needs to be done,
Yeah.
done, and these people need to be helped, and but it's not a crisis, but you're still back in that
Right.
mode of emergency response.
Right. So that mode of what you had to do kind of keeps going. This is really helpful to say that, do we get out of that mode? And then often when I ask people to bring up an incident, they hadn't maybe thought about it for a while. And then once they go back in it, right, it may bring up things. One woman started crying. She said, I hadn't gone back there. Right? This was a university chaplain. It was something happened on her campus, and she said, I was kind of overwhelmed with emotion but in the situation, she I imagine was very, this is what I did, very focused. Yeah, thank you. Any others? Yes.
All three of us mentioned some way of we wish we had gotten some help sooner for ourselves after the event.
Well, did you hear that? We wish we had gotten help sooner for ourselves. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to impress on us is that these are not, while we may effectively rally, there's a lot that's happening to us in those moments. And we often think because we're caregivers, like we're good, we can, and that those incidents actually do work on us. And they often work on us at levels that we don't really pay attention to. They often keep us in modes where we're like, I could definitely say this from a teaching position, that a cumulative wearing on, like, my classrooms have been very turbulent over the past 3 years. Any teachers in the room know this. The outside is coming in, and in fact it always has, but we're maybe more aware. And my classroom's like rocky. Things happen. And I realized that I was operating in a kind of crisis mode whenever I went into the classroom. Because I'm waiting for whatever the eruption to happen. I'm now mobilized for it to happen. And that takes a toll. Now, that toll can be classically what you could call burnout, or a weariness, a kind of collective wear on the system. Some of us carry those physically, that we might end up, with sickness or chronic conditions. But certainly my context of the classroom changed. I don't know when it changed. I would say Ferguson was a tipping point. That there was a sense of despair and anger, all sorts of emotions that came out that suddenly the classroom was a container for that kind of really somatic but emotional work on the part of students. Any other insights that you want to share from the tables? Yes.
Interesting, and if you're responsible for a lot, one of the things is things become very routine. In emergencies, become fully engaged, both intellectually, solving something,
Right.
or trying to get into, and emotionally.
Right.
Because you become fully engaged and then became very conscious of the injustices and inequalities. Why can't the institutions respond in an appropriate way to this crisis, which I brought to their attention? And so there's both an intellectual and kind of an emotional full engagement, which often can be very intoxicating.
Right.
Outside the routine sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing is a kind of, that high functioning problem solution that you actually may be laser focused in those moments, and surprisingly have a clarity that you would not otherwise. I mean, I definitely heard this from the military chaplains. There's also a charge. There's a kind of energy charge, and your body is responding, producing all sorts of chemicals to rally to meet that particular situation. So that it is this kind of high intensity, but you may look back and surprise yourself with how well you did. Thank you. One more? Yes.
So I shared a situation where someone who I knew suggested that I be a first responder to someone I didn't know.
Hmm.
And I think what I did well was trust that person's perception of what I might be able to offer and trust God to go on a journey and approach that person. The person was very receptive, and we started a journey. The journey took a different direction than what I expected and also expanded in scope. When I thought about the second question, what do I wish I had known? I don't think I would have wanted to know where it was going. I think I was just trying to be open to be on a journey with someone.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Somebody pointed out something in you about a readiness that you did not think you had, right? That you wouldn't have necessarily, am I hearing you correctly? You wouldn't have necessarily walked into that situation to provide care. That's a really, I might come back to that. That's very incredible that somebody else saw that and that it set things on a different path. What I want to have us think about is, first of all, to think about how we carry these incidents into our futures, right? And that for some of you, the high intensity work is all the time, right? And that becomes your mode. I'll say it becomes the mode out of which you work. And for some of you, your faith is part of your sustaining resourcing. And for some of you, your faith may shatter and not be able to sustain you at those points. It's not always a positive testimonial that in situations you may turn to your faith tradition and it doesn't provide as much as you need. Or it may give you answers that have sustained for a long period of time, but they no longer will carry you into whatever change there is in the future. These are the interesting moments in which faith in our traditions can both help and harm. This is kind of a number one thing I give to my students. I say the same religious claim can function for healing or for harm. The complexity is that it's like maybe the same thing. It just depends on where it lands and who it lands with. That there's no there's no good claim and bad claim. I want to know, where does a certain understanding of suffering, how if somebody wears it for a long period of time like a coat, right? a certain understanding of how God functions in relationship to suffering. So I wear that God coat for a while, and I want to know what kind of person I become if I wear that coat. And sometimes wearing that coat is like the heaviest burden that someone can bear. And sometimes it's what keeps them warm in the winter. I'm trying to go with the coat analogy. So, but that often, that means I want to know how someone's wearing that theology, and when it may be bring more suffering rather than healing. Does that make sense? Social workers often are really concerned about this because sometimes they see people bring religious claims into a clinical setting that are not helpful, right? That may support them staying in situations of abuse. You know, Jesus suffers, so I suffer. That should make a lot of us suspicious, right? But that they are our theologies that often become unexamined. And that I'm hoping to provide some frameworks for you to kind of think about them a little bit. Now, theologians think about them all day long. But I think many of us in our settings are interested in thinking about, is faith a source of harm or healing? And when in this situation does that, can we see that actually happening? So when I give you a couple of these frameworks, that I'm often the first to say, well, I'm usually the first to say that I'm not a trained clinician. So why do I have any business talking about trauma? That trauma is most recognized as a clinical psychological term. And I wish this was a little clearer, but I'm hoping you can see some of these images. How I got into the study of trauma was I was a student at Yale Divinity School, and I became really interested in what was going on at Yale University at the time, which was a really strong emergence of post-Holocaust studies in various fields of study, but particularly the studies that were being done at the Yale Psychiatric Institute on second-generation Holocaust survivors. So that had become at the YPI, they had been, studying people whose parents had been who were Holocaust survivors, and whose parents never shared necessarily, never told them about their experiences in concentration camps. And somehow the children were having nightmares or experiencing symptoms of their parents' traumatic experience. Some of you will know this as the intergenerational or transmission of trauma. But I was very interested as a student who was very interested in theologies of suffering. I would go sit in on these clinical sessions that they made open to the public about what they were finding from second generation survivors, and what this phenomenon of trauma and its transmission across generations, what was that looking like for people in terms of how they were experiencing their lives. So I became a very curious theology student, and I marched back up the hill to the Yale Divinity School, which was really up the hill. And I marched back up the hill and I said, our theologies of suffering are not really talking about this very enigmatic phenomenon. Is how can I somehow be responding to a parent's trauma that they never told me, right? The non-narratable transmission of experiences. And some of you are very interested in these studies because this question about how my own history impacts who I am. And this has now gotten more scientific cachet in terms of the study of epigenetics, in terms of does our actual DNA sequencing change based on the experiences of our parents? Does it somehow mark on our DNA the suffering, but also I'll say the resilience experienced by our parents? So anyway, so I became interested in this phenomenon of suffering, and at that time at Yale, all sorts of different interdisciplinary partners were coming to the study of trauma, people from literature and history, as well as psychology and psychoanalysis. And I thought theology needed to be part of this conversation. And so you can see, or maybe not see, it often begins the history of the study of trauma. You could say trauma existed, has existed for centuries. But the particular study of trauma, I think, is a modern phenomenon. The study of trauma largely can be traced back to, at the turn of the century, the work of Sigmund Freud, For Good or Ill. We receive our primary observations about trauma from psychoanalysis and its emergence. And then it's taken all of these different, in the 20th century, has broadened beyond psychoanalysis to really think about, we've got Toni Morris in here, who I think is one of our most profound trauma theorists, right? Through her novels, she narrates something about suffering that does not simply go away, right? She narrates something about the generations of suffering and how that marks our kind of present life. I have Elie Wiesel's novel up here too. So you've got the literary people who are trying to think about what does it mean that this particular understanding of a way that we experience in the world, this phenomenon of trauma, what does it mean to understand ourselves as modern individuals and societies in this way? It's also become very strong in the neurobiology, in the field of neurobiology, because they tell us a lot about what happens to our brains. Neurobiology is going to come into the sermon tomorrow because I'm going to talk about our limbic systems, our fight-flight part of the brain, and that we just know a lot more from studies of the brain and brain scans what actually this kind of overwhelming force of suffering is actually doing to us in our brains. A lot of what we know about trauma is through war veterans. Now, that makes sense because they keep data and records, right? That often from World War I, which was actually the turn that Sigmund Freud took, is Freud was very interested that when World War I veterans were coming back from combat, he observed something that has become kind of central to our understanding of trauma, which is he noticed that when the veterans were talking to him about their experience of war, they were not remembering something that happened in the past. They were reliving the past in the present. This is going to be key. They were not just accessing a memory of somewhere back there. They were in front of him in combat, right? That it wasn't a remembering, it was a reliving. So something about trauma is different, he thought, than ordinary experience in that the past is in the present. So trauma has to do with a distortion of time and how we live in time. So something of traumatic suffering is that the past flashes into the present, and your body is saying, I'm there, not here. So it's a kind of collapse of experience in which the past becomes present, and you'll say, not really present, right? So this is typical of what we think of when we think of as a flashback, right? That something flashes. So often when we're responding to trauma, I asked you the image. Did an image come to mind? Did something? So often the flash is operating on our senses, and it comes back to us through sensations, not through a kind of declarative memory. So it often comes back through smell. Smell is our kind of strongest sense. So that when someone says they got triggered, it's a very familiar term, it's usually a sense, right? A smell, a sound, an image. So this is how I first entered trauma, is through the interdisciplinary study, is that different areas were coming together to say, how do we think about how the phenomenon of suffering is impacting our present day? So trauma gets birthed. Instead of giving you definitions of trauma that are all contested, I want to identify 4 things that often constitute what we call trauma. And the first is an overwhelming event. I think you initially used the term overwhelming. An event happens, a force of violence happens, and it overwhelms our systems of adaptation. So what we should start with is we're incredibly resilient, right? I noticed that Roger is tapping his fingers, right? Okay, so I'm not really paying attention to Roger, but I'm aware of some tapping. Okay. Okay, this is part of how we work. We register. I registered whether or not Roger was tapping or whether his fist was clenched and coming towards me. This is how our systems function. We register whether things around us are threatening, are bringing danger. We do this, right, all the time at fast speeds, right? That the human has protective, mobile, sensory intake in which we're registering how we move in the world at rates and processing that we don't even really think about. Neurobiologists think about this quite a bit. So that we're taking in the world all the time. And a traumatic event is often described as an event that overwhelms our capacity to intake it. Something happens when it registers on the animal, right? That the processes that we have for taking in all sorts of events, even events that are difficult or challenging, right? That we process things at amazing and rapid speeds, and we do it incredibly well. So people who study trauma are also, I find it profoundly wondrous how we move in the world with the levels of stress, anxiety that we intake. But typically we process these. When trauma happens, it overwhelms the system, and our typical mechanisms, you could say on a psychological level, on a physiological level, we could even think on a spiritual level, it overwhelms these systems and something goes awry. So I'm not going to give you the full neurobiology, although it's really fun to see a literary type person try to discuss science. But that what happens is something of that event, because of its overwhelming force, causes our system to shut down, and there's a lack of integrating that event into our living, moving, and being in the world. So something gets stuck. Neurobiologically, it gets stuck not in our cognitive register, but in our limbic fight-flight system. What that means is it makes sense of why we're always on a kind of hypervigilance, or you could say a frozenness. That's the other side. Why we're operating in a kind of high intensity. Our body's rallying those chemicals to not only respond to that event, but to respond to all sorts of other events, so that the system is kind of stuck in a hyperactive kind of fight-flight mode, even when there's not danger. Okay, so that it rallies when it needs to respond to what is there. The problem is that it keeps firing apart from the context in which it initially happened. So this is where you can get triggered outside of the context, because the hippocampus, I'm trying to be impressive here, the hippocampus, the hippocampal activity is the one that assigns context. It says, when you were in combat, that was at this particular place at a particular time. The hippocampus does that. In trauma, the hippocampus shuts down and no context is assigned. Isn't that interesting? So that what it means is you're alert for danger, right? But it's not context specific. So that it could come to you at a part in a very different context through sensations, smell, touch. This is why I think it's very important to think about kind of the senses, not only in trauma studies, but in theology, right? Smell, scent, taste, and see that the Lord is good. Taste? What are we talking about, right? But that to activate the senses is actually what we think of when we're thinking about how people respond to trauma. So that there's a lack of integrating that event into what we know of ourselves. It often creates severed bonds of trust. Who and what you trusted before to ground yourself in the world is no longer to be trusted. So some people will identify trauma as a breakdown in trust. And what it means is that our attachments, our connections, our relational world suddenly becomes not so secure. And then what often happens is life becomes reorganized around either protecting ourselves or preventing that, whatever that event was, from happening again. I often use the bodily posture, like we're in protection mode, right? And that most of us, we function very well in that mode, right? We can be incredibly productive human beings. If production is the goal, we can do that and move quite well. But for a lot of us, our religious traditions and our vision of what it means to live in the world is not living in the world like this. I do think this posture is protective, but doesn't open us to what? Reconnecting, to making attachments, to trusting, to loving. So that there's something of trauma that works on us to close us and protect us rather than foster reconnection. So that's how I describe the phenomenon of trauma and its impact. As we've emerged in thinking trauma now several decades, the idea that it's a single event, that like one event happens to us and then we have an after that event, has come under question because many people ask, well, what if it's not just one event, but a series of events, right? Close after that have been studies to think about, why is it that I respond to something very differently than someone else? We could both experience the same event, but what makes Roger kind of stuck in that event, and I seem to be doing just fine. One explanation is that there can be developmental trauma, which is something could have happened earlier to Roger that makes him more susceptible to whatever it is that other event brings up. So you have a cumulative or often known as developmental trauma. But the other thing I think that's become interesting to think about is what does it mean when trauma is not an event, but the conditions of existence that you live under, right? That there are many people who move in the world, and because of who they are, they're more susceptible to harm than others. Maybe because of the color of your skin, your sexual orientation, that you move in the world with a low level or high level sense that you will be harmed. And that when events happen, they're not just a single event. They're conditions of existence under which you live. This is really important for people who are caregivers, because often we think high intensity situation, we go in to deal with the problem, right? But we don't often take into consideration maybe the populations that we're working with are actually dealing with insidious trauma. This is the term, is to think about because the resources in their community are less than other people, right? Or because of systemic racism, that when events happen, there's more susceptibility because of a kind of conditions of identity. It's more challenging to think because a lot of the work on trauma has been a traumatic event happens and then there's a response to it. But how do we think in these more nuanced terms about certain ways of being in the world make you, more vulnerable? And so that when things happen, it's not just, oh, why is that person doing so well and other people not? That it has a more systemic and insidious dimension to it. So why do I think it matters? I often use the image of this iceberg, is to say if you're attuned to trauma, you're attuned to really what we usually see and we assume is that how people act is usually, their behaviors determine how we understand what's going on for them. But if you're attuned to trauma, you're attuned to all these submarinal, I used to say subterranean, and then I was like, that doesn't really appropriate. These submarinal ways in which what's really motivating people may not be demonstrated in their obvious behaviors. Now, if you start thinking in this way, it makes you very curious. Because I don't assume necessarily that what people say to me is what's really going on. Once you're attuned to trauma, you pay attention to different things. And one of the things I used to think that if a student speaks out in class that I was a really nervous early career professor, and I used to think like somebody's really angry at me, right? They say something. I no longer assume that what is being presented is the full picture. And a lot of why I don't assume that anymore is because so much is going on for people at levels that certainly I don't register, but that they may not even register. So that I just pay attention to different things. I pay attention to gestures. I pay attention to how bodies move in the world. And a lot of that has been influenced by what I know about how trauma works on the brain. So how do we locate, I think one of the challenges that trauma brings is how we locate trauma in the brain largely calls into question how much we're really functioning in our frontal lobes, right? Our rational language part of the brain. Trauma really turns us to think about this fight-flight system and what I'll call the more emotional and somatic register. Now, I love it. I'm in a room of Presbyterians, or maybe some. Presbyterians are super cognitive. I went to Princeton Seminary. I got a lot of Reformed theology. And so this high capacity functioning intellectual brain doesn't really help us too much to really, develop spiritual muscles to see that so much is happening in our more kind of emotional, less cognitive register. So yeah, I got that out with Presbyterians. Because I started talking about trauma and it was like so disembodied that it was, I don't know what I was doing. But so I would go out and give these talks, these very heady talks about trauma, and people would come to me, after the talk, and they'll say, I'm in a lot of pain, or like, this happened in my family. And I was like, I can't help you with that, right? And I was like, I've got my little, but so what I realized is that I become more attuned to the fact that I can, have my frontal lobe going very strongly. But the second that you mention trauma, it just touches a different part of somebody. And I think it touches a different part of who we are as caregivers too. So I've had to really think about how I even talk about some of these topics, because so much of what people bring to the work is also personal work, that many of us who work in trauma or as caregivers have our own histories that we bring. And often we're not even aware of how much that they're operating, but the work is never very simple. I think how we rely on words and narratives, and it's interesting, most of the theological work that I do is narrative work. So I could talk a little bit more about that, is how I think stories, sacred stories can touch these different sides of trauma, but that really our words don't always help us. The challenge of some of the neurobiology to talk traditional talk therapy is to say you can talk all you want, but talking is not going to talk trauma out of the body. That trauma is located somewhere else. It's not located largely in our cognitive register. So if we think people are going to tell us their stories of trauma, we may talk, but so much else is going on. So how much we assume we know about what motivates people, I've already said this. I kind of have an epistemic humility about that I'm no longer certain of what's going on for folks. And I think what that means is that I'm able to kind of make the classroom a curious space. Like, I don't know what people bring. And if I don't know it, but I know it's there. So how do we work with that to say, because sometimes when we're working with people, we really want to know the story of what happened to them. There was one specific woman in my classroom who I knew had a very, very challenging history, but instead of asking her to go into the story, I worked very differently. Because even if I wanted to know the story, that was about me. I don't really think she needed to tell me what happened to her. So I think this is a kind of interesting thing in your caregiving work, how much you have people narrate the trauma that they experienced. I really don't, so I think a lot of that just doesn't need to happen. And maybe because I'm really convinced that a lot of work is somatic, right? Is that I pay attention to gestures and I allow someone to be angry because in Peter Levine's work, Somatic Experiencing, the animal needs to work out the energy. So often we stop people from being angry and for acting, right? And instead we should say, if I touch the animal, they might release that energy, and that's going to be very difficult. Not you, Fritz, but that what I might get is an explosion of affect and somatic energy. Most of us are not prepared for that, right? So those in the room, how do you work with anger in your work? And often, I don't know, maybe it's we don't work with it very well. It's like, ooh, we calm the person down. Well, what if in our religious traditions, we let people, what? Be angry. Wow. Okay. Now, what I'm saying, as I'm doing that in my classroom, it does not feel good. It often doesn't feel successful, right? It feels like I fail as a teacher again and again. But I'm more convinced that working with the anger rather than avoiding it is what we need to be doing in trauma work. So how do we provide containers for people to express the emotion without what? Hurting each other, hurting themselves. I'd love to hear from the clinicians in the room how you work with that, right? I'm married to a social worker, which is really, I test these questions out on him, and I think he's not afraid of anger. I mean, I think that's the most powerful lesson that I've learned, is he really works, he says he works from the premise that people are doing the best they can with what they have, and which I think is astounding given the kind of people he works with, but that he's taught me not to be afraid of anger. So also see that as a gift that you can give to others, those of you who are in those fields. Okay. So this is what I'm working on now, so I'm testing out new material on you. I'm writing a book on theology for first responders. I should have kind of put that out there. And I think the 4 things that I've learned about trauma become this lens through which I view not only people, but this is how I read the Bible. So you're going to hear some of that tomorrow if you come. That it's become for me a way of interpreting the sacred text within the Christian tradition, and I'm also working with scholars in other traditions. I think rabbinic teachers really do this well. They have means by which they probe their sacred texts. So I'm thinking about scholars in other traditions too, is when we look at our sacred texts from a trauma lens, what does that mean? And there are 4 things that you could probably hear in the comments that I made earlier. The first one I assume is that the past is not in the past. That something of the phenomenon of trauma means that the past is still operating strongly in the present. And so that shapes how I think about how I read biblical texts, how I read human situations, is that I think the past comes forward and often erupts into the present. So when we think about, I'll say specifically about movements like Black Lives Matter, when we see kind of eruptions of a kind of protest in the present, they're insisting that the past is not in the past. I think it's very profound, right? To say something of the present is coming forward. These are long histories that are not simply like a blip on the screen. Like suddenly there's a group that's angry. But that something of the past history is coming forward into the present. And I think this can be very positive. is that it comes forward, trauma tells us, in order to be integrated. This is the key, right? That the past doesn't come forward just as traumatic repetition, but that it comes forward because there's ethical work to be done in the present. So that it's not just negative, the past just comes in the present, but it comes because it wants to be integrated, right, into a kind of vision of life that is restoring something back. So there's an ethical dimension, I think, to this. The second is the body remembers. And this really is how we register trauma, is largely kind of the emotions or the memories are lodged in our bodies and not in our frontal lobes. The third is that the wounds often live below the surface of our lives. This comes out in my recent book more strongly, is that often we really don't want to see wounds. And I'm using wounds in the broad sense, that a lot of, we really are okay with the kind of harm lying just below the surface. But it's there. And people who study trauma know that the wounds are there even if they're not visible. That kind of changes how you think, right? That just because they're not there, that actually because you don't see them and they're there is how they, register a kind of low-level harm. The fourth is that healing requires layered work of witnessing difficult truths. This, I think, is a question of when wounds actually rise above the surface of our lives. I'm really interested in knowing what happens. Are there communities who can witness those wounds, or do our communities just push them below the surface again? I would say that a lot of our Christian communities are not very good. Like, we want to make things better, but we're often calming the animals down rather than seriously addressing the wounds. So in a lot of my biblical work, and I know I have biblical scholars in my midst, in a lot of my biblical work, I say the Gospels themselves call us to do wound work. So why is it that the risen Jesus, appears to the disciples with the wounds still there? In the Gospel of John, why are the wounds still there? And what does he do? He tells the disciples to see and plunge their hands into the wound, right? So there's something about the nature of discipleship, of being a disciple, that requires working with wounds. But we often don't read it that way because the wounds have something to do with something else. But that often we don't want to, as Christians, we should be, very good at dealing with wounds. We got wounds all around our tradition. But often the tendency is to push them aside or push them away. So what does it mean to read our gospel text? If I read biblical text and I gave you these four things, if I gave you any biblical text, and I'd say, what does it mean to think about this text as the past not being in the past? What would it mean that the body remembers? So I'm reading all this stuff about smell in ancient Christianity. It's very fascinating, is to think about how much the sense of smell is even in our biblical texts, but we don't pay attention to it, right? I'm like, there's all these scents going on in the ancient scriptures, but we tend to privilege sight and sound. Those are the two privileged senses, right? Vision or seeing has often been very high in terms of religious conceptions, right? To see God, to know God, but also Presbyterians, sound, right? The hearing of the word. This was very, very important to John Calvin. But that often seeing, sight and sound becomes the primary senses, that are used in connection to kind of knowing and our relationship with God. But what about smell? No, those scents were most associated with women in ancient Christianity, right? They were the lower senses. Bad news, women. We were associated with the lower senses, right? But actually, it's those senses that operate a lot in traumatic experience and traumatic recall. So maybe we are the tenders of the wounds. So that privileging sight and sound, we miss so much of these other senses. Okay, so I'm giving you a little bit of a hermeneutics to live by, and that you'll see this, I think, hopefully I preach it tomorrow. Who knows? I'm very scared of preaching, just to let you know as a teacher. So I think this rubric of a kind of trauma lens also expands how we think about the medical model. So often we trust the medical model for our diagnosis. And I think that there's some really important ways that people of faith can question whether the models of suffering offered in our medical systems are all there is. That was a very kind way of saying that maybe our religious traditions have different ways of thinking about suffering. And that actually, I found this in my work with chaplains, and I've been working with mental health providers and people at the School of Social Work, and they find me kind of quaint because I'm like, well, in the 4th century, but I actually think it brings a very holistic, our ancient traditions bring holistic visions of healing, of suffering and healing that are really, really important to thinking about how we view the world, how we view the human condition. We've got a whole repertoire of theological explanations for who human beings are, but we defer to clinicians. I'm trying to provoke you a little bit. We defer to the medical community to say whether we're healthy or not. So what does the hymn say? It is well with my soul. What does that mean, right? What does it mean when peace like a river? I could break out in song, but I will not. It is well with my soul. What is that? It's often thought of as crusty old language, but I think it's really important for us to revive our sense of what are we talking about of human beings having their souls well, right? So in my book, I really work a lot with the text in the Gospel of John, and I think what I want us to think about is how do our sacred stories, our practices, our faith, how do those stories meet the stories of our lives? And I think the stories of our lives are incredibly sacred. So I don't just want to say the sacred story is some story that we find in biblical text, but I think the stories of our lives are sacred, and that I want our biblical texts to revive our sense of what does it mean that our lives are sacred? What does it mean to read the stories of our Gospels, the stories in our biblical text, to read them in terms of fear, right? The fear that we have of kind of what's going on around us. How do our stories actually speak to that? And often they don't. So as a theologian, I get, we don't expect that much from our biblical texts. At least I don't think we do, right? They become so familiar that we're like, yeah, we know what they say. But in fact, if we bring the stories of trauma to our biblical text, we would insist that they have to do much more work, or that we have to do a lot more work in thinking with them. What does it mean that Jesus comes back to a room full of disciples, shows them wounds, and reorients their perception to the trauma around them? I think Jesus is doing that, coming back and saying, the way that you work with wounds is at the heart of what it means to be a disciple. And yet we don't always view it that way. Jesus the healer comes back, right? Jesus the healer comes back, and what does he do? He is now the one with wounds. And he says, touch them. Wow. Okay, I really love the Bible, so I just had to. So I wanted to just mention, because I don't have a lot of time, to just mention, I did at the beginning, is to think about this term, moral injury. And anybody heard of this term or working with this term in their setting? You are? Yeah. I did.
And that was when it was so revolutionary for me personally to think about moral injury.
Yeah.
View and my relationship with God and anger and forgiveness and it was quite, I tried to explain it to people the next day. I was so excited about moral injury.
Yeah, so this is a documentary called Almost Sunrise, and it narrates two veterans who are coming to terms with the harm that they did at war that stays with them. So when you think about trauma, it's a kind of unintegrated event that stays with you. Moral injury has emerged as something different and distinct from trauma. I'm going to show you the chart. This might be helpful. Has emerged to say that maybe when we think about, this is coming from the VA, maybe when we think about trauma and treating PTSD, there's something that we're not addressing. And that what soldiers and service people are wrestling with may not be best identified or only identified as a stress disorder. That they may be suffering the impact of what they did at war. So trauma is often thought as in terms of a kind of victim reception, right? The harm that happened to you. What about the harm that you committed against others? Is that a different kind of injury, right? And so researchers within the VA were saying, well, with some of the people we're working with, we've actually done quite successful treatment on PTSD symptoms. So we seem to see a reduction in PTSD symptoms, but people are still suffering in this different way. And it's the term emerged from a war psychologist, Jonathan Shea, who identified it as a kind of injury to one's moral order. That when someone has done something that violates their moral code or their sense of right and wrong, it seems to leave a mark. Something seems, even years later or decades later, seems to stay with them. So it's probably not well termed, but perpetrator trauma, right? That moral injury results from acts that are committed or witnessed. It's very interesting to think about, that you might yourself have done, but that you could also have witnessed that happening. That violates one's sense of right and wrong, and it leaves imprints or marks that may be happen long after. So one of the vets, I interviewed some people in a veteran healing group, and Peter, one of the veterans, said, I lost my soul in Vietnam. And he said he's somebody who got lots of treatments from the VA. He used every resource that was available to him. And he said there was still something that remained untouched, which was a soul injury about what he did. That does not leave me. He said, I'm working with alcoholism. I've dealt with some of the relational harm that in my family, but that some things I've done have not left me. And so the concept of moral injury came from Jonathan Shea, who's trying to say he was originally, and I think I'm saying this right near the White House, who's responsible for moral injury is actually the military commanders, right? That moral injury was something that should be an injury on those who command people to go to war, because they're ultimately responsible for acts that are being done in the name of the nation. This term has shifted from thinking about a kind of commander's injury to thinking about that the veteran himself or herself carries that injury. Why Shea thinks it's so problematic that it gets individualized is that the moral and political critique gets removed, and suddenly the veteran herself is responsible for the act they've committed. I just gave you a lot in that short sentence, right? But that moral injury has become kind of a private clinical diagnosis, and there's a lot of folks who want to say, no, we really want to keep the indictment for the moral injury, who's really responsible, with those who are kind of higher up the chain of command. So this term, I think, has become really important in the times in which we live, because it's obvious, I think, to many that moral injury has a religious and ethical component to it, and that religious leaders, Rita Nakashima-Brock, Gabriella Latini, the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School are really exploring what does it mean that religious people are speaking up about what we think about as moral injury. And I'm just going to close with this. Moral injury has become now kind of a contagious term. And it's so interesting and not surprising why. It emerged within the veteran setting to think about the harm that the residue, the moral residue of the harms that we commit at war. But it's expanded really to think about our broader climate in which we live, is what does it happen when our souls, the moral horizon has shrunk, or that maybe collectively we have violated our sense of right and wrong. A much more collective diagnosis about maybe we're living in a time in which our souls are shrinking, that we've given over something, or that our moral compass is broken. Does it make sense to you why that term has moved out of the veteran world suddenly to think about much larger? I think people are exploring it to think about that as agents in the world that we commit moral violations, right? In our everyday life, we operate with moral dissonance. There are things that we just really don't want to see, we don't want to deal with, but that something at root in us knows that it's not right. Whoa, I feel that a lot, a lot. Or maybe others do harm to us and our moral horizon shrinks because of what has been done to us. It's being picked up to think about racism or Muslims within the military. This is the context in which I met it. Is one of the Muslim chaplains said to me, after 9/11, I've been, I'm a service member, and after 9/11, I became an enemy within my own people group, right? That a kind of targeting of her as a Muslim chaplain as being an enemy when she'd served in the military for 25 years. These are the kind of complexities that I think the term moral injury is identifying. And as people of faith, this is a new horizon for religious leaders to start thinking about. And I'm at time. I promised Theo I was going to end at 11:30. 11:45. I've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Maybe 5 more minutes, and then we need to go. If you want to take a question.
Oh, I'm done. Thank you. I just dropped moral injury on you, like in the last 10 minutes. Yes. Could you, talk? Do you want to come up here? Come up here. Oh, there's a mic. Oh, nice.
So I've been thinking about this for a long time, maybe 14, 15 years. And one of this larger concept of moral injury, and one of the reasons was because of my concern about torture. And some may remember that we studied this in our Christian education here, and we took this up as a topic. And one of the people who spoke out about this, it comes again from the veterans context, was the former head of military chaplains, Kermit Johnson, Presbyterian, who had resigned as head of chaplains during the Reagan administration because he was opposed to Reagan's nuclear policy. But when this whole subject of the United States collectively engaging in torture came up, he wrote and spoke quite a bit, and we studied him here, about the collective moral injury of our engaging in that, the toll it was likely to take, the predictable toll it was likely to take on individuals and on us collectively. And if you're interested, you can read his article in the Christian Century from 2006. So I've been thinking about this question for a long time, and I don't think there's any question but that this is a phenomenon and that it operates on us all limbically, not only as individuals, but as communities.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of you're pointing to early work, right? So these are, it's not that new, right? But somehow the name and the diagnosis has brought up conversation. So I think it's an important thing to recognize these are longstanding moral quandaries and moral acts committed on the name, in our name, that then, we can somehow pretend that they're not impacting us, right? I think this diagnosis, but they really are working at a kind of erosion of our moral fiber, whatever the terminology you would use. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm from Metropolitan AME Church. I wanted to ask you, I found it very compelling when you started to talk about the Bible and the implications in it that connect us with the moral challenges that we face today, the moral injuries, and John 20. Can you offer one or two more scriptural references that we might look at and think about as it compels us in this work of responding?
Yeah, I could defer to our biblical scholars here. I actually think the whole Bible. But that's because I've got that hermeneutic, right? As I say, it's not so much certain. I think there's incredible biblical scholarship around particular passages that have been problem violent passages of even God's character is severely called into question by what God asks the people to do. But I think it's more thinking about noticing things. If we're attuned to trauma and moral injury, we ask certain questions. We see certain dimensions of any of our biblical texts, not just particular passages that are moral injury passages. There is, however, a really good book called Exploring Moral Injury in Sacred Texts that are different scholars from different religious traditions who are saying, well, what does it mean to think about moral injury in the Quran? What does it mean to think about moral injury in the Gitas? What does it mean? And so there is a kind of emerging scholarship. But I think the questions that we ask change. The questions that we ask when we look at any biblical story change if we think about what are people asked to do in this biblical text? Or what do they do, and what does it mean that the impact of those decisions lasts beyond that particular incident? That would be ways in which I definitely think the Gospels are powerful, because we can think of the Gospels as all attempts for the disciples to make sense of the trauma of Jesus' death. So something of Jesus' own, what Jesus asked the disciples to experience is to witness death. And their lives after that death are profoundly changed. So the Gospels, I think, are the most readily available. But I think it's in the questions that you would ask any biblical text. What does it mean to read this text differently now that I know something about, what's the moral residue? How do I think about times in which the communities in scriptures, in which the community acts in a certain way that seems dissonant, right? And what do we notice? So I hope that's helpful. I actually think it's what you bring to reading any of the biblical texts that you might find instances of trauma and moral injury, that it actually has a lot to say.
I think thank you for the reference to the Gospels and how, in terms of the trauma of Jesus' suffering, which I think is a question we're always wrestling with. So
Yeah, the Emmaus story, so I could go to the ending of the Markan Gospel. The ending of the Markan Gospel is, the short ending is incredibly unsatisfying, right? There's ends in shock and and the body is missing. And then we have the additional ending.
One quick question or comment that we are going to have to close.
Yeah, it's a comment. Just as you were coming to the conclusion, you were leading me to think that we experience collectively, especially in the last couple of years, it happened before the last couple of years, but collectively, just getting up in the morning and turning on the news and seeing all the nonsense we're getting bombarded with, and then it's not dawned on me, but it's like a lot of this is not accidental, it's intentional, and it's a manipulation, and it's been tried in other parts of the world and tried quite successfully, which is why there's been so much, I think, such an expansion. It seems like we're having more and more trauma.
I do think it's helpful. Thank you for that. I do think it's helpful to read to interpret what's going on as working on our limbic system. I'm going to preach this tomorrow, right? Is that we think we're operating in this high cognitive register, but that so much is working on us, and I think wearing down our souls. If I asked each person in the room, in the work that you do, what has changed in the last several years? What's the impact that you can feel on your spirit, on your soul? That many people, myself included, would testify to that it's really hard to keep my heart open. It's really hard not to feel the residual wear of a kind of seeping of our I'll call it shrinking of our moral imagination. That we've kind of lose our capacity to see beyond what's in front of us. And man, that's the work I think that's being done slowly, that we really need to be careful of, is our capacity to see the world any differently than what's actually going on. So thank you for that.